Deep. Deep with the.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to the plenary session of AIB SAP 2026 on how India can cope and thrive in the current turbulent international business environment with Lachilapan and Sabyasachi, flexibility and ambidexterity. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce Professor Farooq J. Contractor as the speaker for this plenary session. Professor Contractor is a distinguished professor of management and global business at the Rutgers Business School, Rutgers University, USA. He holds a BS in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Bombay and an MS in the Industrial Engineering from the University of Michigan, with an MBA and PhD from Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. Over several decades, he has positioned himself as a globally respected scholar in international business, strategic management, and global operations. His research has made seminal contributions to firm internationalization, strategic alliances, foreign direct investment, outsourcing and offshoring, technology transfer, and joint ventures, with over innumerable peer-reviewed articles and many books to his credit. Professor Contractor has taught and delivered executive programs at the leading institutions worldwide, including Wharton, Copenhagen Business School, NTU Singapore, the IIMs, and IIFT. At Rutgers, he has held major leadership roles such as the department chair, research director of cyber, and the PhD program coordinator. He has also served as the president of the Academy of International Business 2021 and 22 and widely authored widely a global business blog with the audiences over 170 countries. Sir, it is our privilege to listen to your august views. I would now request sir to begin the session. The floor is yours, sir, for the discussion.
Thank you very much. I apologize. I don't know why the camera does not allow me to be seen, but as long as the slides are visible and my voice can be heard, I think we will have to proceed on this basis. And I'm also hoping that at the end of my remarks, we can take some questions and answers, because that is as important a part as the formal presentation. So I hope I can proceed, yes?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Welcome. So I begin with an overview of the recent turbulent international business environment, which seems to be dominated by two countries, the US and China. And it's an astonishingly skewed distribution. We can understand why these two countries are so prominent in global affairs. They shouldn't be. I mean, there are 193 nations. Why should two dominate is a good question. But anyway, in terms of economic size, they contribute 42.7% of world GDP. Using current exchange rates for the dollar and yuan or dollar or other currencies, the US is the leading economy with 26%. China follows at 16.6%. But if we use the purchasing power parity exchange rates, China is leading and has led since 2015 as the biggest economy on the planet. And that's not because they are so rich. It's just because they are 1.4 billion population, so that even with the middle income per capita, they have become the biggest economy in terms of overall GDP in PPP terms. Now, by comparison, if you look at the Japan, India, and the UK, they occupy a mere 3.7, India is 3.5, and the UK is 3.4% share respectively. And by the time we reach rank 20, a country called Poland is not even 1% share of the world economy. And here's the astonishing fact that the lower rank, so-called lower rank, 189 nations out of 193 account for less than half of the global economy. And countries below the median, which is 95th rank, They occupy trivial shares of 0.04% to 0.01% each. So here's a picture of the ranking from the IMF. You can see this is based on nominal GDP, the actual GDP, not PPP. Let me see if there's any WhatsApp message from the organizers here. No, that's fine. I can continue. And by the time we get down to India, it's 3.5%. And as I said, by the time we get down to rank 20, Poland, it's below 1%. So the geopolitical rivalries between the US and China have heightened, not only because of the central state policies of the Chinese government, which many Indians don't like, but also because in the West, in the US and in Europe, there's a rise of right-wing populism, sentiments of my country first, everybody else does not matter. And by the way, the mention over here, I don't know if you can see my cursor down below. This is a paper that's been published last month in December in International Business Review, which covers the geopolitics and its influence on international business. Anyway, what we see is escalated tariffs and trade protection. For example, India has been hit capriciously and suddenly with a 50% tariff on Indian and Brazilian products by the US administration. Both China and the US are retaliating with export controls on so-called strategic minerals and advanced technologies. China controls all the products made from rare earths and has occasionally embargoed them, while at the same time the US has been embargoing the export of advanced AI chips and so on. So the back and forth tit-tat retaliation continues. We have more intrusive screening of foreign direct investment proposals, which used to be called in the US 20 years ago socialism, but now they're doing the same thing, where every major proposal is screened and some are refused or deterred. And of course, in China, that's been going on for a long time. We see also industrial policies and subsidies given by governments. And that has now become the sort of norm, even in India, with the employment and productivity subsidies under ELI and other schemes. Driven by techno-nationalistic competition and increased government intervention in global value chains. So the question is, between the two hegemons, USA and China, are mid-ranked countries like India or Brazil or smaller African nations squeezed in the middle? I throw in a few academic references for anybody who wants to follow up on my remarks. So India seems to be struck between trade exclusion on the one hand with a 50% tariff. Obviously, that excludes a lot of Indian products, or most of them, or can. And on the other hand, there's a huge trade surplus that China has against India, or India suffers a trade deficit. I mean, the official ratio is something like 11 or 12 to 1. But I suspect that it's even worse because of a lot of smuggled Chinese products coming in to India from China. And you know, the news last month from even Mexico under USMCA renegotiations pressure has announced a 50% tariff on US imports. The USMCA is the US-Mexico-Canada trade bloc, as it were, which is coming up for renegotiation this year in 2026. And therefore, Mexico has sort of buckled under the pressure and imposed a 50% tariff on Indian products. And the move will hit sectors from automobiles to car parts, smartphones made in India, steel, textiles, and Indian exporters have spent years and years building relationships and supply chains and now face an uncertain future. And by the way, when we say about automobiles, we're talking about Maruti, Hyundai, and Volkswagen that export vehicles and parts from India. So we used to have, and just 10 years ago, 20 years ago, a so-called most favored nation doctrine, patiently negotiated by WTO, which is the World Trade Organization. And that most favored nations principle was simply that you cannot unilaterally increase tariffs on selected countries with lower tariffs on others. If you do it for one country, you've got to do it for all. In general, there's been an abandonment, or we're beginning to see the abandonment of multilateral institutional arrangements like the WTO, World Bank, IMF, etc., which for at least 15 years had set common rules and limits for governments and multinational enterprises, what governments could or could not do in terms of international business. And I hope this does not happen, but there are two papers, one from Gopinath, who was the chief economist of the IMF, and the recent paper by Luo and Tong in Jibs, which says that maybe the world might degenerate into two rival hegemonic camps, China and the US, each with its own alliance or network and international business relationships, but not cooperating too strongly with each other. I hope it does not happen, but we seem to be headed in that direction. So just a historical review, phases of globalization. From 1950 to 1990, international business was mainly a story between the US, Canada, Europe, and Japan. India was under license Raj, with businesses and multinational enterprises. MNEs, short for multinational enterprises, were suspect. I mean, all big business was suspect. Some historians among you, or people who have read Indian history, might remember that under the Indira Gandhi government, many multinationals actually left India. Not because they were forced out, but well, they were forced out because of a rule by the then Indian government that foreign equity should be limited to 40% shareholding in the subsidiaries or affiliates in India. And that was enough for a lot of foreign companies to just leave India, shut down operations. So I myself actually worked for a while with the Tata Group. I was a TAS officer working for what is now Tata International. And we wanted to start a finished leather products factory in Madhya Pradesh. And we promised the government that we would be 100% export oriented, at least in the beginning. And at that time, India was desperately short of foreign exchange. We said we would hire at least 1,800 to 1,000 people, create jobs. There would be ancillary businesses supplying chemicals and other products. So it was a win-win situation, a win-win argument with the Indian government. But the reaction of the bureaucrats in Udyog Bhavan was no. You are Tatas, you're big conglomerate, you're suspect. So they made us wait and wait and wait for 2, 3, 4 years before giving permission. And that was one of the reasons I quit the Tata Administrative Service and went to the Wharton School to get an MBA and PhD and became an academic. The other reason, of course, is that as the announcement said, I have 2 degrees in engineering. And engineers suffer from a defect, if you will. We are very particular. So when I didn't have a finance or a business degree, I did the spreadsheets for the project anyway, and made the mistake, if you will, of including Naya Paisa in my spreadsheet. And when it went to the board, they said, what is this? Why is this spreadsheet got naya paisa? Well, I was an engineer trying to be very exact, which was a mistake. Anyway, so they said, who is this? Who is contractor? Does he have a finance degree? Answer is no. And so I thought I'd better, with the delay in the license caused by the license Raj, go to the Wharton School and get my MBA. And then I got my PhD, and I've been an academic at Wharton. I taught at Wharton and Rutgers for many years. But starting in 1991 until, let's say, 2015, was the golden era of globalization. In India also, many of you will remember that under the Narasimha Rao government, who was prime minister at that time, India had done so badly in international trade that its foreign exchange reserves were down to a dangerously low 2 months only. And that created the new policy by the government of opening up the economy, enabling, inviting multinationals to come back, do more trade, engage more in international business. And after 1991, India's average GDP growth was a very good, enviable 6.5% annually until 2016, and has increased even more since then, according to World Bank data. And India's poverty rate was halved by 2012 and has drawn lower even today. So this is a happy story for India. However, that period of global era of globalization, golden era of globalization, was followed in 2016 by two signal events. Number one, the Brexit, the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. And number two, the election of Donald Trump, the first Trump administration, all of which signaled the rise in populism, I should say, my country first sentiments, to hell with everybody else, multilateral institutional rules being eroded, unilateral and capricious, sudden transactional behaviors from the hegemons, US and China. Of course, India has continued its fast growth rate, but now there are threats, at least in the international business arena. So India's exports and FDI inflows, India's participation in international business lags badly, even though it's a big economy and has liberalized. The FDI inflow to GDP ratio is only 1.4% for the 3 years 2022 to 2024. By comparisons, for the all-country average is 3% in 2023. Now, this is not a criticism, because India has sometimes been accused of being protectionist and insular and so on. But I see this as an opportunity for multinationals and for India's development, where with incentives and attractive policies, the numerator of the ratio, which is FDI inflow, can rise to the global average or beyond, because multinational enterprises bring technology, talent, standards, etc., to the countries in which they invest. So anyway, much of the next few slides are how can India cope with the more turbulent international business environment? What are some coping and thriving strategies? First of all, geopolitical neutrality. I reference a paper by Nirupma Rao, published in Foreign Affairs, which is a prestigious political science journal in the US, where she and co-authors are echoing essentially what the Narendra Modi government is saying, that we will not align with any major power or bloc. Flexibility and ambidexterity. And by the way, I'm not claiming to be knowledgeable in Sanskrit, but Google helps. Lachilapanam for flexibility and Sabyasachi for ambidexterity. These are some of the coping mechanisms which reveal alternative pathways to advance in turbulent times. And of course, there's a management literature, which I cite over here, O'Reilly and Tushman, Du and Chen, which talks about the managerial benefits of ambidextrous management. which means following multiple paths, maybe simultaneously, and selective alliances as needed. In a transactional environment, which we are right now, martial arts provide examples of using the opponent's strength to one's advantage. So the next few slides are talking about interdependencies for India's net benefit. We all know that a long time ago, John Dunning, one of the pioneers of international business scholarship, talks about market seeking versus efficiency seeking versus knowledge seeking FDI. So when you're engaged in global value chains, which is a fancy way of saying international supply chains, you're linked with a foreign firm, which is different from being just an exporter through an agent of rice or mangoes. So GVCs can benefit a weaker country participant and give leverage in future negotiations. By the way, to put things in perspective about the US tariffs on India's products, in the last fiscal year, April 2024 to March 2025, the export of India was 86.5 billion, or around 10.5% of India's total exports. They went to the US. Excuse me, let me try and increase the lighting over here. Give me a minute, please. Okay, so to put things in perspective, in the trade negotiations with India, even with the general 50% tariff, services exports, which are like 48% of the total, are exempt, not subject to US tariffs. And I'm going to essentially give an example of Apple, where the GVC partner is successfully lobbied on India's behalf. Tim Cook became a lobbyist on India's behalf because iPhones assembled in India, which now comprise around 20% of Apple's global production, are imported into the US currently tariff-free, persuaded Trump to exempt iPhones from the 50% tariffs. And India has replaced China as one of the top suppliers of US iPhones to the US market. And I've got a reference for that over here. All international trade involves risk, but usually in a normal environment, the risks are outweighed by mutual benefits. And the greater the mutual dependencies, it's more difficult to capriciously and suddenly break the global value chain or efficiency seeking foreign direct investment. And also, I'm going to be talking about geographical diversification of export and FDI destinations so that capricious changes in one import country does not affect too much the entire sector. Now, India said no and withdrew from the RCEP treaty, which is 15 nations, which will soon meaning in a few years, become the world's biggest trading bloc. So flexibility and ambidexterity doesn't mean always saying yes. It means saying no when it is, I guess, sensible or expedient. And the reason India withdrew from the RCEP treaty is essentially because of Indian farming or Indian farmers who are, of course, 55% of the population and a dominant voting bloc. Also, India has a 2,000-year tradition of compassion. In Hindi or Sanskrit, it's called karuna, towards the less fortunate in society. And the trouble with Indian farming is that each plot, on average, is only 1.08 hectares, with minimal technology and mechanization, and they've resisted vociferously the government's attempt to reform agricultural production and distribution. For example, and this is a problem because with the same cultivated area as in the US, roughly under farming, India uses 98 times the number of farm workers. And most of them, beyond the planting season or harvest, are unemployed or marginally employed. And the yields are not very good. The rice yield is only 4,444 kilos per hectare, compared with the US farms' rice yield of 8,500 kilos. In corn, it's a comparison between 3,300 kilos per hectare versus 10,500 kilos. And so I guess the Indian government is right, at least in identifying, trying but failing to reform the agricultural sector, because that's what it takes to make a country developed, and gradually transition the as many as 797 million rural Indians into organized industrial service sector jobs. And that's where foreign sourcing from India can make a big impact in creating jobs. And India, as we know, is critically short on manufacturing sector jobs. I'll show a slide a little later, where India's share in global manufacturing is only 3.3% or something like that. Now, by comparison, Apple having done FDI in India or having alliance arrangements with local companies, employs as many as 120,000 direct workers, plus a reported additional 230,000 indirect jobs in 45 sub-supplier companies in Maharashtra, Gujarat, and other states. And you can look this up in the article under India Today, Tech 2025. So just one company, Apple, has made a very demonstrated effect in job creation. Of course, global value chains or international supply chains also create dependencies on the import side. An iPhone is mainly assembled in a screwdriver assembly by India, but components have to be imported into India from more than 15 countries. In 2024, India exported to the world 26.5 billion in finished drugs. So there's also dependence or mutual dependence between the US and China. US and India and China, of course, on generic drugs. So while India exports 26.5 billion, it is dependent on Chinese inputs of active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, to the tune of approximately 3.4 billion. So there are three broad conclusions. The duality or link between exports and imports. Number two, all countries export competitiveness or participation in international supply chains is very much linked to trade openness, where a government facilitates easy movements of both exports and imports through ports. And I think the Modi government has done a lot in the last 10 years in improving infrastructure in Indian ports, because there were comparisons which said that moving cargo through ports in India would be anywhere from 5 to 7 times as many days as through Bangkok, for example, or other major Chinese ports. The presence of MNEs, multinational enterprises in India, can boost manufacturing jobs and output, I mean, India is a nation of 1,450 billion people, of whom at least 450 million are either unemployed or only seasonally employed at planting and harvest times, or selling peanuts or balloons or bananas on the sidewalks, parks, and beaches, with an inventory of less than maybe 500 rupees sometimes. So geographical diversification, additional foreign markets in addition to the US. And just to put things in perspective, the US remains the world's largest importer by far, something like 3 or 4 trillion, and the largest economy, accounting for 26% of the world GDP. But in PPP terms, the US occupies only 14.8%, and the US share in world imports, although the biggest among countries, is only 12.45%. And the rest of the world, besides China and the US, at least wants to believe or continue to believe in the net advantages of globalization. And so other markets for Indian products, such as the European Union, the UK, where trade is still seen in terms of reciprocal benefits as opposed to reciprocal tariffs, presents an attractive opportunity. And perhaps belatedly, the Indian Union Trade Minister last year in August announced a budget for export promotion targeted at 40 potential countries, such as the UK, UAE, Russia, Japan, South Korea, and so on. And India has continued to have bilateral trade negotiations with other countries or small groups of nations, possibly on the assumption that it would have a more favorable and controllable negotiation with those countries as opposed to the US or China. And the examples are the CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the UK in July last year, or the India-EFTA agreement with Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And by the way, they were accompanied by these vague promises that they would invest 100 billion in FDI into India. And it sounds like a vague promise because in the agreement itself, it is nothing more than a sentiment or a vague promise. But the fact remains, as we know already, that trade and FDI are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have global value chains or international supply chains without FDI, and vice versa. Ongoing bilateral negotiations are proceeding with the EU, Australia, Peru, and Chile. So this slide is talking about clever backdoor strategies with multi-stage supply chain links. Because sometimes a component made in one country can cross national borders 3, 5, or even more times, adding some value in each country before reaching its final customer. And I give two references where one piston rod, which is in the internal combustion engine in a car or truck, purchased by a US assembly operation, had materials and inputs crossing 6 borders. So for example, Indian automobile parts could be exported to Mexico, which are then put into a sub-assembly. The sub-assembly crosses the border north into the US, where another American company in the supply chain adds value. Then it's shipped back to Mexico and is finally shipped to the automobile or truck or car assembly operation in the US. Indian smartphone companies, of course, these are small players like Dixon or Micromax, who would import components from South Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, have it sub-assembled in Vietnam with final phone assembly only in India, or only final phone assembly in India, and then exported, the mobile phone exported to the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, and so on. So the backdoor strategies is the idea to access larger trading blocks via the smaller countries. So the UK and EFTA negotiation can provide a backdoor entrance into the European Union, which is a far bigger trading bloc, because they have preferential or free trade agreements with the EU. Peru and Chile negotiations, when they are fully implemented, would give Indian exporters favored access to Mercosur, which is the Latin America trading bloc. For example, an Indian component exported to Peru or Chile can be finished by them, and then the finished product re-exported to the larger trading bloc, the European Union or Mercosur. So to give you a recent example of how this worked in practice, suddenly after 2018, there was a huge surge in FDI coming into Mexico. From China mainly, but also from Europe and other countries to do assembly in Mexico. And then the finished product exported to the US under the NAFTA agreement, which is the North Africa Free Trade Agreement, of which Mexico is a part. And similarly, Chinese companies facing trade barriers into the US quietly created subsidiaries in Vietnam, FDI subsidiaries, because it's faced lower trade barriers in the US under the Made in Vietnam label compared to the Made in China label. And India can do the same thing by doing FDI in other global South nations which have lower tariffs than India and export from there. For example, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Mauritius. Currently, I mean, all that can change, but currently in the US tariff administration, these countries face lower tariffs than India does. So to give you an example of the amount of FDI coming into Mexico between 2021 and even 2021 and 2024 October, it creates such a demand for the Mexican peso that the Mexican peso actually appreciated. In this scale, by the way, can my cursor be seen?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, a little louder, please.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So the vertical axis is the US to Mexican peso exchange rate, which means devaluation is upward and an appreciation of the Mexican currency is downward. And you can see that the Mexican peso had reached 21 or almost 22 in early 2021, and it appreciated all the way to almost 16 by April 2024. And that was all because of Chinese and European FDI in Mexico to assemble components from China, let's say, and ship the finished product to the United States. So this is a strategy that can be adopted by India as a coping and thriving strategy. And, you know, as I said, international supply chains and FDI are two sides of the same coin. According to the UNCTAD, in more than 3/4 of world trade, there's an MNE on one side of the deal acting either as exporter or as an importer. 55% of world exports, and by the way, world exports now last year totaled 33,000 billion or 33 trillion. I'm sorry, in 2024. More than half, 55%, is not in finished products, but in intermediate goods and services as opposed to finished items, most of which are supply chains orchestrated and managed by multinational companies. So participation by multinational enterprises in India's economy needs to be a necessary component in India's economic development, job creation, boosting manufacturing output, and have those partners, those multinational companies like Tim Cook, actually approach the American and European governments and lobby on India's behalf out of mutual self-interest. 97% of Global 500 firms, Fortune Global 500 firms, orchestrate or are part of GVCs. GVC is Global Value Chains, which is just a way of saying international supply chains. Actually, this is not correct. It's 55. Well, I don't know, because 55% of world trade in 2024 was not finished products, it was intermediate. Now, we don't know what intermediate is, but components and finished, semi-finished items were at least 37%. I'll have to refine this statement a little later. And here's another astonishing fact. Not only is a multinational company either as an exporter or an importer in 75% of all trade, world trade, but the same multinational company is both importer and exporter in 40% of world trade. So you can see the importance of multinational companies being part of the value chains or international supply chains. And they're also, of course, the designers and orchestrators of global value chains. So my recommendation is that invite multinationals. The Indian government already does that, has rolled out the red carpet with a lot of incentives and attraction for multinationals to come to India. That doesn't mean an unqualified welcome, because some multinational business may not be as favorable to India as others. So incentives need to be very selective and given only in cases where that makes sense. But anyway, in general, FDI or MNCs or MNEs bring latest technology, investment capital, organizational methods, meaning management practices, higher labor and safety standards, a managerial culture, global supply chain links, sustainability and green ideas, and especially when there's a joint venture and they become alliance partners, there's a self-interested transfer of technology to the Indian partner, and in some cases, even joint R&D and brand management. And even from just trade, not even FDI, there can be learning. The whole idea here is for Indian engineers, for Indian companies to learn from reverse engineering, learn marketing savvy, global supply chain links, and higher standards demanded by foreign buyers. Now, it is true that participating in global value chains creates interdependence, which some would consider negative, saying, why should our country be dependent on others, especially if they are going to suddenly put a tariff on us? Well, the point is that yes, in the early stages, like Apple is doing today in Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, and other states, is screwdriver assembly. It's not very skilled, but at least it's a first step. Because after that, with sufficient learning and interaction with the multinational company, skills are upgraded and more sophisticated operations are given to the supplier as a valued partner. Maybe already we see that Apple is not just doing screwdriver assembly in India, but is commissioned a few Indian companies to produce components for the iPhone. So eventually, participating in global supply chains or value chains is a step up on the economic development ladder compared to the earlier years. And this is how countries like South Korea and even China, now I know that Indians don't necessarily like the Chinese government, but if you look at their policies over the last 40 years, China succeeded brilliantly in terms of learning from FDI and acting as suppliers to Western firms. So that today, it used to be 25 years ago that most exports from China to the rest of the world were done not by Chinese companies, but were done by multinational European, American, Japanese companies in China, based in China, exporting from China to the rest of the world. Today, something like 3/4 of China's exports are done not by multinationals in China, but by Chinese domestic companies, because they've learned after 40 years of interaction with, with the Western and Japanese firms. So if you look at the number of patent filings, China has already progressed. I mean, as far back as 2011, if memory serves me right, the number of patents filed by China exceeded the number of patents filed by American companies. Now, of course, we should take a big pinch of salt with that statistic, because a lot of the patents filed by China was simply because the engineer or the scientist got a bonus. But the fact is that even in international patent filings outside China itself, China is now beginning to rival the US in technology. So they've definitely progressed from imitator to innovator and from apprentice to master. So in the 1980s and 1990s, China and Vietnam had few skills, little R&D, but eager copycats. And talking about job creation, the estimate is that 230 million Chinese left their villages in the interior of China and even left their children with the grandparents to migrate to the east coast of China to become manufacturing workers. Initially, they had no skills, but today they do. And look at where these countries are today. Not just South Korea and China, but Taiwan, even Vietnam, which I think just 30 years ago, Vietnam was poorer country on a per capita basis than India. But today, Vietnam's per capita income is 4 or 5 times as big as India's, partially because of their openness to trade and FDI. So the key word is learning, harnessing. I'm not saying be a servant of multinational companies, but harness them to create more knowledge transfer, higher standards, international supply chain links, and so on. And this can be done, and the Indian government is doing this with targeted incentives to make foreign companies dependent on India. The employment link scheme, the export-oriented project worker housing scheme, cash outlays linked to specific performance criteria. Yes, there's an initial cost, but the long-term gain is millions of jobs and technology transfer and making the foreign partners lobbyists on India's behalf. So ambidexterity, Sabyasachi, means doing several things simultaneously, even if they appear contradictory. I have another recommendation for how India can cope and thrive in a difficult international business environment: tariff jumping strategies. And already, more than a few Indian companies have done that. It can be a substitute strategy to producing in India and exporting. And of course, it avoids the foreign nation's tariff. So examples are here, Mahindra and Mahindra in Michigan, Bharat Forge in North Carolina, Sun Pharma in manufacturing facilities across the US, Dr. Reddy's, Lupin Pharmaceutical, JSW Steel, Wellspun Group, Tata Consultancy Services, and 150 big Indian multinationals have already invested more than 22 billion in the US, creating in the United States 125,000 jobs across all 50 states. And there are many uncounted, thousands probably, of smaller Indian firms that have done FDI in the US, which are not even measured in the statistics. So in general, there's 7 rationales for developing companies like India to produce in high-wage destination markets. So first of all, number 1, tariffs are avoided because you're producing inside that foreign market. The US manufacturing worker may be paid 24 times as much, but with automation and labor discipline, in some cases, American workers are also 24 times as productive in output per hour, per worker hour. In that case, it's a wash. Now, of course, I'm not saying that rationale number two always happens, but even if it partially happens, it narrows the wage gap between the American worker who I think is paid $37.1 per hour on average, compared to the Indian worker's wage, which is more like $2 per worker per hour. And US production, of course, avoids the international transportation costs. Production in the foreign country, jumping over the tariff barrier, enables better and quicker management of inventories, and just-in-time deliveries. Logistics are simpler. Being in the foreign country through FDI, tariff jumping FDI, gives marketers and managers better insights into the customer behavior and the needs of customers. And it becomes, in some cases, part of the US innovation network, the R&D network, which boosts research capability. And top-ranked IT companies like Tata Consultancy Services, Wipro, Infosys, etc., they're not just writing software. I mean, they do write software for companies, but the enterprise software becomes a platform to enable organization change. And so in a way, these IT companies from India have become organization change consultants, providing a basis for strategy consulting. Yes, screening of FDI has increased. In the US, what used to be a very minor bureaucracy has now become a huge bloat. It's called CFI-US, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which now involves everybody from the White House, the Commerce Department, Homeland Security, even the CIA, so that investment proposals to do FDI in the US are now screened by the committee, and a few are refused. China, of course, has been doing this through MOFCON for a long time, which is the Foreign Investment Security Review Mechanism. The European Union has its own screening mechanism, as well as each European Union country does it as well. So there's increased government meddling around the world, unfortunately, some would say, in commerce. Now, that doesn't mean that the welcome mat for multinationals has been withdrawn. On the contrary, accompanying greater scrutiny, there's also been a proliferation of FDI soliciting, FDI attracting, and trade promotion governmental bodies, because most nations continue to recognize the net benefits of international business. I say net because there are always going to be some bad apples, some bad investments where the foreign firm draws much more benefit than it contributes to the local country. But for the most part, FDI, international business, has been beneficial. That's why I say net benefits, not unequivocal benefits. So while India actively promotes FDI, but the bureaucratic mentality, which has been fostered over more than a century under British rule, can be and continues to be viewed by foreigners, as well as domestic Indian companies, as excessive and a deterrent to business. I was very, very curious over the last several years hearing the expression red tape. And I was wondering where red tape as an idiom or cliche came from. Well, it comes from Britain. I actually found two novels by Charles Dickens where he mentions red tape. So India has unfortunately inherited this bureaucracy from the UK or from the colonial rule. And after 75 or 77 years, it's now time to get rid of that. And the Indian government is recognizing that fact, the Modi government. So just to recapitulate, in the 1970s and 1980s, South Korea, Taiwan, and later in China, they were doing basic screwdriver assembly for multinational company buyers. But eventually, look at these countries where they are today. I mean, China's per capita income with a comparable population is now, what, $18,000 per person per year, whereas India's is still below 5,000. And China, of course, has become China, South Korea, they're manufacturing powerhouses. So the question for Indian strategy is, should India go for manufacturing, which gives jobs to millions, as regulatory impediments are reduced, labor laws are liberalized, infrastructure is improved. I mean, we're talking about labor laws. Years ago, I had a school friend, a schoolmate who had a business. He's now retired. And he used to tell me, I dare not employ more than 99 people. So I said, what is this nonsense? Why 99 people? Why don't you expand? Is it because you have a bad product or a limitation in expansion? He said, no, I can expand my production in India a lot, but I will not employ more than 99 people. Well, the reason, as many of you know, is that once you cross into the 100 employees bracket, there's all kinds of laws and inspectors and corruption and so on that hits businesses. And the Modi government, even last year, has tried to, I think they've introduced a scheme to liberalize the labor law so that 100 employees does not become an unreasonable limit. And of course, the Modi government has done very good work in improving infrastructure. Manufacturing with Indian labor at around $2 per hour, at least in theory, India can take over from China the title factory for the world and avert a demographic time bomb. And maybe I'm being too scary here, but I look at the fact that 450 million Indians have only temporary or seasonal jobs. And you can see that it can become a time bomb. There was a recent advertisement by the Indian Railways for clerical jobs. And I think several lakh people applied, and there was even a bit of a riot for the exam or whatever. So there's a crying need for job creation. Or should India go for services? Because India is excellent in services, following the example of Tata Consultancy Services, Wipro, Infosys, and so on, and other companies like Huawei and Teva to create more technologically complex portions of the value chain. Focus on knowledge, technology, R&D in pharmaceuticals, increase the brand value in India and internationally, go for high-value services. Which should India do? Well, India's manufacturing output, being only 3.3% of world output, could increase with so much labor eager for jobs. By comparison, China produces 28% of world output. The US is no slouch, 16 or 17%, Japan, Germany, compared to India. Even a country like Mexico, which is a much smaller population and much smaller economy, contributes half of India's manufacturing output. Okay, this is an old slide, to be honest with you. This is based on a report, article I published in Journal of International Management in 2021. So the data go back before 2019, actually. And this is when the World Bank used to have a survey, which was called, business excellence or something like that. And I identified in this article 7 impediments to Indian manufacturing in terms of scale. Just the sheer size of factories can make a big difference. And labor productivity, labor laws, which the Indian government is trying to change, labor disciplines and unions. Now here, when we say number 3, since this article was published, the transport costs have really improved. I mean, there used to be something called octroi, where a truck coming from Nagpur to Mumbai would take 10 days, not because of the road condition, but because they were stopped by inspectors and tax collectors on the way. The Indian government has done a tremendous job in improving the availability of electricity and power. Land acquisition is still a problem. The permit raj still persists, unfortunately. And Indian companies are still not as good as Chinese or Koreans in terms of international marketing savvy. So in terms of the ground reality, I mean, this consulting company called Team Lease has come up with a report saying that bureaucracy is still very much of an impediment. Well, sorry, this is the same slide. I'll jump ahead. So the answer is clear. Not just manufacturing or services, but do both. Now, when you look at the service sector, especially in pharmaceutical research or in IT, it's people like you in the audience, children of fairly affluent, by the comparison with the rest of the population, fairly affluent parents with good degrees. And how many people are employed in Indian services? Only a few, maybe 50 million or so. I'm talking about sophisticated services, not selling bananas on the footpath as a service. So services, definitely India must and can do it and improve that. But the real job creation has to come from manufacturing. For the target 7.6% annual GDP growth rate announced by the Modi government for India 2047, by harnessing and utilizing multinational companies and continuing to liberalize Indian business. And just very quickly, Atmanirbhar, which is another Sanskrit term, is not incompatible with internationalization. They go hand in hand. And Indian companies are very clever at striking a good bargain. In fact, the moment is right for India to do much more in international business, especially for the more than 450 million Indians who are unemployed or marginally employed. And maybe if things succeed, American and European companies that want to decouple from China can come to India, like Apple has demonstrated successfully. So the conclusions, these are my last few slides. The Indian government and companies are very capable, well capable of dealing with what many people say is a turbulent international business environment, characterized by populism, transactional attitudes, and even capricious national policies where Trump suddenly announces one morning that, oh, I'm going to put such and such tariff on such and such country. 2,000 years of Indian commercial business with the rest of the world. I mean, there's a wonderful book written by William Dalrymple, which talks about the trade between India and the Roman Empire 2,200 years ago. And recent excavations on the Red Sea coast, which was part of the trade route from India to Rome, has revealed that there are Indian temples in what is now Egypt. Why? Because Indian traders were there. There were hundreds and maybe thousands of ships going between India, the west coast of India mainly, and the Red Sea. And then the cargo would be transported by camels and horses to the Mediterranean, where again ships would come and take the cargo to Rome. So Indian companies have a 2,000-year history of international business. to be flexible, resilient, ambidextrous, pursue multiple strategies at the same time, and not necessarily retreat into India's own protectionist shell. So my conclusion, my overall view is that the future looks very bright for India, even in a turbulent international business environment. So thank you for your kind attention. I look forward to any questions, and I'd be more than happy to respond. I'm sorry that my picture, I cannot be seen, but from the audience, if there are any questions, I would be glad to answer.
The floor is open for questions.
I hope a microphone is being passed around.
Hello. Anyone? Good evening, Professor. I'm Santosh from IIFT. According to your studies, you have talked about ambidexterity. And in volatile state where India is in terms of FDI, how do you think can we balance the low-cost manufacturing on one side and exploring the high-tech R&D on the other side?
Yes, thank you for the question. The answer is basically do both. The children of educated and richer parents like the audience, they can go into engineering, research and development, IT, and other services, good. And India is excellent at many of these already. But the number of jobs that are created in these sophisticated services amount to only a few tens of millions of jobs. By comparison, in China, number of people engaged in manufacturing is something like 300 or 400 million. And India has a crying need at low wages and people eager for jobs. I mean, if you pay enough, Indian workers can become motivated and even productive. So the future, I think, is both, but greater emphasis needs to be put on the manufacturing for Indian domestic demand as well as for exports.
Thank you, Professor.
I thought I saw, yeah, please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. I'm Rahul Jaswara from the batch of 27. So, as we know, there's a lot of countries that specialize in exports like Thailand, Malaysia, Mexico, China, and they take advantage of the vast amount of FTAs that they sign with other developed nations. So, do you think that India signing more FTAs with markets that with larger markets can help India in becoming a manufacturing giant and an exporting giant?
Yes, thank you for the question. That is exactly my point, that India is lagging badly in terms of, let's say, FDI or trade as a percentage of GDP. Now, I'll make two comments about that. Comment number one is that India's average is way below other countries, probably because the denominator of the ratio, where the numerator is international business and the denominator is the GDP. India is such a big country in terms of population that it is going to soon become the third biggest. I think by 2027 for sure, at current exchange rates, India will overtake Japan to become the third biggest economy. But that's because of a big population and low wages and unemployment or underemployment. So that India's FDI or trade to GDP ratios are low simply because the denominator, the GDP, is so big. But at the same time, it gives an opportunity to increase the numerator of the ratio by increasing India's participation in international business, by attracting FDI, especially FDI that is more oriented for exports compared to the Indian domestic market. And then those partners, the foreign company partners, can become lobbyists on India's behalf in other countries. And then I also mentioned the backdoor strategy, where India is doing this, creating bilateral negotiations with smaller countries like Peru or Colombia and so on, to use those to do FDI from India to those countries, to assemble over there and ship from there to big markets like the European Union or the United States, where the tariff rate is lower. Of course, I think one of my slides I skipped over is the question of the transshipment criteria, because the US government in the last few months only in the last few months, has become very sensitive to the idea that Chinese components are simply assembled in Mexico and then shipped to the US with lower tariffs or much reduced tariffs. And they're now looking at the entire value chain. So the US has introduced rules for what percentage of value is added in which country to qualify for the lower tariff. So the backdoor strategy is an interesting idea, but it has to be consistent and legal with the laws of the importing countries, which is something that can be done by managing how much value is added along each part or each country in the international value chain. So did I answer your question? Otherwise, please come back with a follow-up.
Yes, sir, but I have a follow-up question. So, a lot of these exporting nations have free trade agreements with a lot of like developed nations. So, I guess that also contributes to their export, to gaining access to the export markets. So, do you think that if India signed more free trade agreements to those developed nations and the larger markets, will that benefit in the companies moving into India and seriously considering India as an export market rather than a market where they can sell their product, or as a large consumption market?
Well, India is a large domestic consumption market, but at the same time, there are so many hundreds of millions of people who really would appreciate a good paying, stable job in manufacturing. I mean, from my point of view, there's nothing wrong with being an assembly worker. I mean, it's better than selling peanuts or sing chana or bananas on the footpath. Anyway, to answer your question about the free trade agreements, India has that with the UK last year, but not with a big trading bloc. Now, India was part of the negotiations for the RCEP treaty, which was 15 countries. And India withdrew from that because the counter argument or the demand was to open up Indian agriculture. And the same thing with the US. Open up Indian agriculture, buy GM wheat and corn, et cetera, and that the Indian government has refused or delayed for very sensible reasons, because 55% of the Indian population is still farmers and rural people, and a big voting bloc. And as I said, also, there's a 2,000-year tradition of Indian compassion, or karuna, which means you want to not badly affect so big a percentage of your population with sudden trade agreements. But so my point earlier was that one of the classic ways of economic development is to transition farmers into manufacturing. Let me give you an example. In the year 1865, a similar percentage, 55% of Americans, were farmers or in the rural areas in 1865. But by let's say 1970, only 2% of American population were farmers. And today, it is approaching 1% of the American population who are farmers. And yet, the US is one of the biggest agricultural producers in the world through mechanization, and IT, and so on. So a big challenge for India is not only on the international business side, but also on the farming, how to handle the need or how to transition so many 55% of the Indian population into skilled jobs. So free trade treaties are good, especially with 15 countries, let's say, because then India would be able to export so much more. But the government has, I suppose, sensibly withdrawn from that negotiation. But individually, on a bilateral basis, it's continuing to negotiate free trade agreements with the UK last year and other countries. But that's only one country at a time, which is more like a patchwork rather than a 15-country, or what used to exist in the golden era of globalization, which was universal rules applying to all countries. That, unfortunately, is, if not disappeared, is being eroded.
Thank you so much for the answer, sir.
Thank you.
Hi, Farokh. Good evening. This is Sumit calling.
Hi, Sumit.
So, question, Farokh, is that about the non-aligned movement? India many years ago led the charge for the non-aligned movement.
Right.
Given the current geopolitical landscape, the question that comes to my mind is what is the future of the non-aligned movement, given the tension between the two Cold War, parties, namely the United States and Russia, and what should be the role of India in the global South as it relates to non-aligned movement?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Sumit. I think the phrase non-aligned movement has been morphed into what you said as the global South. And countries like India and Brazil are considered leaders of the global South. Now, of course, Trump doesn't like that phrase at all. I mean, part of his animus against Brazil, India, and South Africa comes from this idea, why don't they ally with us? Why are they non-aligned? So I would say India's policy should continue to be non-aligned, or not necessarily ally or be dependent on any one bloc, either the Chinese bloc or the US bloc in economic terms. Russia, you mentioned, Russia is not an economic power. It's a smaller country, economy. I mean, they're considered to be a military power because they're spending huge amounts of their national budget just on creating weapons and being aggressive with neighbors. But Russia is not a big economic power anymore, and its population is declining. So the whole idea about ambidexterity and flexibility is to keep India unattached, to seize opportunities when they make sense for the Indian government and economy, and refuse opportunities like the RCEP when the domestic costs exceed the international benefits. And the sentiment in the foreign ministry in India, as well as from the previous foreign minister, I think her name was Nirupma Rao, under the Congress party. She and co-authors published an article in Foreign Affairs, which is a leading international political journal in the US, saying India should not be aligned specifically or strongly with any power or bloc, to preserve that flexibility.
So a follow-up question, is that a realistic solution, for? Because given the geopolitical landscape and the tension exists, both on the economic side as well as on the political side. And so how does India handle, this tension?
Yeah, there's no escape, because you have an aggressive neighbor on the north, which is China. And now, at least under the Trump administration, you have a negative view of India from them. Maybe things will change with an election in the US, but for the moment, there's no option but to remain unattached, flexible, ambidextrous for the foreseeable future. And as I pointed out, the US was, and I guess still might be, India's biggest export destination, but it was only about 12% of India's total exports. So there are 193 countries on the planet, and India has not done enough in developing trade and FDI links with them, with the other 180 countries, as it were. And that's happening now with a new scheme to develop India's exports and marketing savvy.
Thank you, Parag.
Thank you.
I hope we don't have any more questions. As we come to conclude this insightful session, we extend our sincere gratitude to Professor Contractor for such a compelling and thought-provoking address. By seamlessly weaving together historical context to the present, along with real-world examples, Professor Contractor highlighted the possible coping and thriving strategies for India. The knowledge-stimulating dialogues offered valuable perspectives to everyone present. Thank you, sir, for such an inspiring and intellectually foresighted session, and to the audience for an engaging participation.
Thank you very much. I wish I could be there, but other tasks kept me from arriving in India until this morning, actually. And so I've been scrambling to put this together. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And enjoy your cultural program.
Thank you, sir.
So as sir mentioned, we now have a small cultural program followed by a gala dinner at the atrium. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.